The sky was dark that evening, covered with thick gray clouds that swallowed every bit of sunlight. A small passenger plane made its way through the storm, trying to reach the city before nightfall. Inside, passengers sat quietly, holding on as the wind shook the plane. Among them was a man in his early 30s wearing a simple jacket and holding a small photo in his hand. It was a picture of his wife and young son, smiling on the front porch of their home. He had been away for months, working to save money for a better life, and now he was finally going home. The man had promised his son he would be back before his birthday. He had already bought a small toy airplane as a gift, tucked neatly inside his bag. Every few minutes he looked out the window, hoping to see the familiar land below. But all he saw were endless clouds and flashes of lightning. The flight had been smooth at first, but as they entered the mountain range, things began to change. The captain's calm voice came through the speaker, telling passengers to stay seated and keep their seat belts fastened. The plane began to shake harder. Some passengers prayed quietly. Others held each other's hands. The man with the photo closed his eyes and whispered a promise to his family. "I'm almost home." On the ground, in a small house at the edge of a quiet town, his wife was preparing dinner. She kept glancing at the clock and the small calendar pinned on the wall. A red circle marked the day her husband was supposed to return. Their little boy sat on the floor with his toy cars, asking every few minutes, "When will Dad come?" She smiled each time, hiding her worry. "Soon," she said softly. "He'll be home soon." The radio on the counter was playing softly, but suddenly the announcer's voice changed. A breaking news report came on, saying a small aircraft had lost contact with air control somewhere over the northern mountains. No one knew yet what had happened, but the words hit her like thunder. Her hands froze, and the spoon she held fell into the pot. She stood there, not breathing for a moment, then rushed to the phone. She called the airline, her voice shaking, but the operator could only say they were investigating. The boy noticed her face turned pale and came closer. "Mom, what happened?" She forced a smile, wiping her tears quickly. "Nothing, sweetheart. Let's wait a little longer, okay?" Hours passed, then days. Search teams were sent into the mountains, helicopters flying low, scanning the white slopes for any sign of wreckage. The weather was cruel. Snowstorms made it impossible to go deep into certain areas. Every night she stayed by the phone, refusing to sleep. Neighbors came to comfort her, bringing food and prayers, but she barely ate. She just wanted to hear someone say they found him. Weeks went by. Then the officials came. She knew what their faces meant before they said a word. The search had been called off. The plane was presumed to have crashed, and there were no signs of survivors. She felt the world collapse around her. The room spun, her knees gave out, and everything went silent. The boy, too young to understand, kept asking when his father would come home. She didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. She simply said, "He's away for now. He'll come when he can." And in her heart she clung to a thin line of hope that refused to break. The house grew quieter over time. Friends stopped visiting as often, and the world slowly moved on. But she didn't. Each morning she made tea for 2 cups, placing one across from her as if waiting for him to sit there again. She kept his jacket hanging by the door, never washing it because it still smelled like him. At night she would sit by the window watching the stars, wondering if he was out there somewhere waiting for rescue. Years passed. The boy grew older, but his father's absence followed him everywhere. Every time he saw a plane in the sky, he would stop and stare, his eyes full of questions he never asked. He grew up hearing stories about his father, how brave, kind, and hardworking he was. His mother told those stories not just for him, but for herself too. It was her way of keeping the man she loved alive. Life was not easy. She worked long hours at a local shop to support them, often coming home tired but still managing a smile for her son. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit alone at the kitchen table, staring at the old photo, the same one he had carried on that flight. She had found a copy years ago, framed it, and kept it beside her bed. In it, he was smiling at her like he always did, with eyes that promised he'd never leave. The world had forgotten the flight. News stations stopped mentioning it. New stories filled the headlines, but she couldn't forget. Every few years, a small article or an online rumor would appear about hikers finding old plane parts or debris, and each time, her heart would race. She would call the authorities again, asking if it could be his plane, but each time it wasn't. Her son, now a teenager, often told her to let it go. "Mom," he said once, "it's been so long. Maybe it's time to stop waiting." She looked at him and smiled sadly. "You don't understand," she said. "When you love someone that deeply, waiting doesn't feel like waiting. It just feels like breathing." One evening, she went through the old box of letters he had written her from his work trips. Some were torn, others yellowed with age. In one, he had written, "If I ever get lost, promise me you won't stop looking. Not for me, but for hope." She traced the words with her fingers, tears falling on the page. That night, she lit a small candle by the window, something she had done every year on the anniversary of the flight, and whispered a quiet prayer to the sky. People often told her she was holding on to a dream, but she knew better. Something inside her refused to believe he was simply gone. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was love. But to her, hope was the only thing stronger than loss. Outside, the wind blew softly through the trees, and far above a plane passed, leaving a silver line across the sky. The sound made her look up. For a moment she smiled, imagining him waving from the cockpit, calling out her name, saying, "I told you I'd come back." She closed her eyes, whispering into the quiet, "I'll keep waiting." What she didn't know was that far away, in the very mountains where his flight had vanished, something still lay buried under snow and stone, something that had yet to be found. And one day it would be. That day would come when another pilot, flying the same route, noticed something that shimmered under the sunlight. Something that would awaken the hope she had carried in her heart for all those years. It had been almost 20 years since the small plane vanished into the mountains. The world had changed. New airports had opened, technology had advanced, and people had long forgotten the incident. But high above those same rugged peaks, airliners still crossed the sky every day, carrying passengers who never imagined what stories lay hidden beneath the snow. One of those airliners was flown by a middle-aged pilot who had flown countless routes across the country. He loved his job, but more than that, he loved the peace that came with being above the clouds. Flying had been his dream since childhood. And every time he looked out of the cockpit window, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. That morning, the sky was clear when he took off, but as his plane neared the mountain range, the weather began to shift. The sun dimmed behind thick gray clouds, and the wind started to pick up. He had flown this route only a few times before, and the region was known for unpredictable weather. Still, he felt calm. His co-pilot handled the instruments while he watched the horizon, alert but steady. Then something unusual caught his eye. As they descended slightly to avoid turbulence, he noticed a faint metallic reflection on the ground far below, something that glimmered sharply, as if sunlight had struck a mirror. It lasted only a second before disappearing again behind a layer of fog. He blinked, unsure of what he had seen. "Did you see that?" he asked his co-pilot. "See what?" came the reply. He leaned forward, scanning the mountains again. There was something down there. Looked like metal. They both peered through the glass, but the fog thickened quickly and the light faded. For a moment he thought maybe he'd imagined it, just a trick of light bouncing off ice or rock. But something about it stayed in his mind. It hadn't looked like a natural reflection. It looked structured, as if it belonged to something built by human hands. After landing safely at the airport, the pilot couldn't shake the thought. Most people would have moved on. Flights were busy, schedules were tight, but he felt an unusual pull to mention it. After refueling and completing his post-flight report, he added a note about the reflection he had seen. It was a simple sentence. Observed possible metallic structure on northern ridge, coordinates roughly 35° north, near old air route sector. When he submitted the report, the officer at the desk raised an eyebrow. "You think it's a new crash site?" "I don't know," the pilot said honestly. "But it didn't look recent. Whatever it was, it's been there a long time." The officer nodded and made a note, though it was clear he didn't consider it urgent. Reports like that came in often. Pieces of debris, old equipment, or just illusions caused by sunlight and ice. Still, he logged it into the system as per procedure. Days passed. The pilot went on with his flights, but that strange reflection haunted his thoughts. Each time he passed over the same mountain range, he tried to look again, but weather and timing never aligned. He wondered if he should have pushed harder, maybe insisted that someone investigate. Elsewhere, hundreds of miles away, in a quiet government office that handled aviation records, A retired investigator spent his afternoons reviewing archived flight data. He was an old man with a gentle face and a deep respect for stories left unfinished. One day, while reading through new incident reports, he came across the pilot's note. The coordinates caught his attention. They were eerily close to a case he remembered from years ago, the missing flight that had vanished without a trace. He opened the old file, yellowed with time, and stared at the last recorded location of the lost plane. The numbers almost matched. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible after all these years? He spent the evening comparing maps and weather records. The area where the pilot had seen the reflection was remote and covered in deep snow most of the year, which explained why no one had ever found anything. He couldn't be certain yet, but something told him this wasn't a coincidence. The next morning, he called the aviation office that handled old disappearance cases. "There's a pilot report you should look at," he said quietly. "It matches an old missing flight." At first, the official on the line didn't seem very interested. Cases that old were usually considered closed. But the retired investigator's voice carried a quiet conviction that made people listen. "If I'm wrong, I'll admit it," he said. "But if I'm right, a family out there deserves to know." Within a few days, the report made its way up the chain of communication. It reached the Regional Rescue Coordination Center, where officers reviewed it alongside old case records. When they pulled up the name of the missing pilot from that decades-old flight, one of the younger officers paused. "There's still a next of kin listed," he said softly, scrolling through the screen. His wife never changed her contact information. They sat in silence for a moment, realizing what that meant. Someone, somewhere, had been waiting for answers all this time. A call was arranged. A local official visited the family's old address, not sure if anyone still lived there. To his surprise, the same woman opened the door. Older now, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes still calm and kind. When the officer explained why he was there, she froze. For years, she had learned not to expect such visitors. Her voice trembled as she asked, "You said a pilot saw something?" He nodded gently. "Yes, ma'am. It's not confirmed yet, but it could be linked to your husband's flight." Her hands covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. For 2 decades, she had lived with silence and no new answers, no new hope, and now suddenly, someone was telling her that maybe, just maybe, her husband's plane had been found. That night, she sat at the kitchen table in the same spot she had sat countless nights before, staring at the phone. Her son, now a grown man, came home from work to find her there, shaking slightly. She told him everything, her voice breaking with every word. He didn't know what to say. All his life, he had believed his father was gone forever, but now the uncertainty returned. "Do you think it's true?" he asked softly. "I don't know," she whispered, tears slipping down her face. "But I've waited this long. I can wait a little more to find out." In another part of the country, the pilot who had made the report was contacted again. Authorities wanted more details, the exact coordinates, weather patterns, and visibility conditions. He was surprised to hear back, especially after assuming his note had been forgotten. When they told him that his observation might have reopened a decades-old missing case, he felt a chill. He remembered that moment in the sky, the strange glimmer in the sunlight, and realized how close he had come to flying past without noticing. "If I hadn't looked down just then," he thought quietly, "no one would have ever known." As he hung up the call, he stood by the window of his hotel room, looking out at the runway lights glowing in the dark. Planes were taking off one after another, their lights rising into the sky. Somewhere out there in those cold mountains, a story was waiting to be finished, a story that had slept under snow for far too long. And soon, because of a simple pilot's report, that story was finally beginning to wake. The call that came to her house that morning changed everything. She had grown used to the quiet ring of the phone, usually from neighbors or her son's workplace, but this time when she picked up, the voice on the other end spoke in a calm, official tone. He introduced himself slowly, explaining that there had been a new development connected to the flight that had vanished so many years ago. At first, she didn't understand. Her heart began to race as the man continued speaking. He said that a pilot had reported seeing something unusual in the same mountain region where her husband's plane had last been detected. The words didn't seem real. She asked him to repeat it, just to make sure she hadn't imagined it. When he did, she sat down, gripping the edge of the table with trembling hands. Her son, now a grown man, walked into the kitchen and saw her pale face. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, coming closer. She looked up at him with teary eyes and said softly, "They think they might have found something." The young man froze. It had been almost 20 years since that day. He had built a life, gone to college, worked different jobs, and helped his mother whenever he could. But the story of his father was always there, like a quiet shadow behind every achievement. Now, to hear that there was news, it stirred something deep inside him, something between fear and hope. They both sat at the table in silence for a while. The officer on the phone had promised to call again with updates once the investigation team verified the details. After hanging up, she simply stared at the wall for a long time, her thoughts racing back to all those nights she had waited for answers. Later that evening, she pulled out the small wooden box that she had kept for years. Inside were letters, photographs, and a few of her husband's belongings. She ran her fingers over his handwriting, reading a short note he had written before one of his last trips. "No matter how far I go, remember that I'll always find my way back to you." She closed her eyes as tears rolled down her face. Maybe in some strange way he was finally finding his way back now. The next few days were full of anxious waiting. Her son checked the news online, hoping to see something official, but nothing had been confirmed yet. The aviation department was cautious. They didn't want to raise false hope until they could send a team to the site and confirm what the pilot had seen. Meanwhile, in another part of the country, the retired investigator who had noticed the connection between the pilot's report and the old case was hard at work. He had contacted several departments, pushing gently but persistently for an expedition to verify the discovery. Many people in his line of work didn't believe it was worth the effort. Too remote, too risky. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was important. He had seen hundreds of cases in his career, but this one had always stayed with him. Something about the story, the young father, the wife who never stopped believing, the unanswered questions, had carved a place in his memory. He felt that after all these years it deserved closure. After several meetings, the decision was made. A small team of experts, guided by local rescue professionals, would head to the mountain area where the pilot had reported the reflection. The pilot himself agreed to help them identify the location more precisely. When the family was informed, the mother's hands trembled again. She didn't know whether to pray for a miracle or brace for heartbreak. Her son tried to stay strong, pretending he wasn't nervous, but every time he looked at his mother's face, he could see the storm of emotions she was trying to hide. That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked quietly into the living room, where a framed photo of her husband stood on a shelf. She whispered, "If they find you, if they finally bring you home, I'll be waiting." Then she sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly as the clock ticked in the background. The next morning, she received another call. This time, the voice sounded more serious but also hopeful. The expedition had officially begun. The team was already flying toward the mountains, carrying equipment and cameras. The pilot who had spotted the glimmer from the air was with them, guiding the direction. The news spread slowly, and though it wasn't on national television, word traveled through local channels and aviation circles. A few reporters even contacted the authorities, but they were told to wait until confirmation. For the mother, those days felt longer than the years she had already endured. She and her son began checking the weather every hour, worried that snow or fog might delay the search. The mountains were known for their unpredictable conditions. Sometimes she would sit by the window, staring at the distant horizon, imagining the rescue team walking through thick snow, searching for traces of metal or broken wings buried deep beneath. Meanwhile, the pilot who had first noticed the reflection couldn't stop thinking about it. He had flown hundreds of times, seen thousands of landscapes, but this was different. It felt personal now. When he received updates from the ground team, he found himself praying quietly for the family he had never met. On the 5th day of the expedition, the weather cleared. The sun came out after days of wind and fog. The team continued their trek higher into the ridge. The pilot stayed in contact from the base, helping with coordinates. And then around noon, a message came through the radio. "We've found something." Those words were like lightning. The team described a metallic object partly buried under layers of snow and ice. It was old, rusted, and half hidden, but clearly not a natural formation. They marked the area and began clearing the snow. The first numbers they saw painted on the metal surface matched the registration code of the missing plane. Back in town, when the aviation office confirmed the discovery, the call was made immediately to the family. The mother's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the rest of the sentence. Her son placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice shaking. "They found it, Mom. They found his plane." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, her tears falling onto the same table where she had once waited by the phone for news that never came. This time it was real. After 20 years of silence, her husband's story had finally resurfaced. For hours, she couldn't speak. Every emotion she had buried, grief, love, hope, pain, came rushing back. Her son hugged her tightly, whispering, "You were right. You always said he'd be found." When the pilot heard that the wreckage had been confirmed, he sat quietly for a long time, his eyes glistening. He thought about how easily he could have ignored that tiny glimmer of light in the snow. How easy it would have been to forget about it after the flight. But he hadn't. And now his small decision had given a family something they had waited half a lifetime to receive. The truth. That evening, the mother lit a candle in her window, the same way she had done every year since the crash. But this time it wasn't a candle of waiting. It was a candle of peace. And though she didn't know what the expedition would uncover next, whether there would be remains, or letters, or anything at all, she finally felt that her husband had been found, not lost anymore in the mountains, but remembered, honored, and loved far away under the cold sky. The rescue team stood beside the wreckage as the sun began to set behind the peaks. They didn't speak much, but each of them felt the weight of what they had discovered. The mountains had kept their secret for 20 years, but now they were finally giving it back. The rescue team began their work at sunrise. The air was sharp and cold, and the wind echoed between the mountains like a whisper from the past. The wreckage lay half buried in snow, its metal dull with time, its shape broken but still recognizable. The team moved carefully, their boots crunching on the frozen ground as they uncovered each part of the old plane. Every piece told a story of what had once happened there. The pilot who had spotted the reflection wasn't part of the mountain crew, but he stayed in constant contact through radio. He wanted to hear every update, every detail. The team leader described what they found: twisted pieces of metal, old seat frames, and shattered windows that had somehow survived decades of storms. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the wreck itself. It was what they found nearby. Just beyond the crash site, hidden under a layer of snow and stones, they found what looked like the remains of a small shelter. It was built from the plane's parts, metal sheets and bits of wood that had been torn from the fuselage. Inside were rusted cans, a piece of old fabric, and the remains of a fire pit. It was clear that someone had survived, at least for a while. The moment that information reached the command post, silence filled the room. It was no longer just a crash site. It was proof that people had lived after the fall. The team moved slowly, documenting everything, treating the site like a sacred place. They found a few personal belongings, a wristwatch frozen in time, a pair of boots, and a small notebook wrapped in what remained of waterproof fabric. The writing inside was faint, faded from years of weather, but still visible in places. A few words could be read: "Still waiting for help. The storm has calmed. We built shelter. Tell my family I never gave up." Those words hit everyone deeply. They were simple, but they carried a weight that no one could ignore. The message spoke of courage and hope, of someone who refused to surrender even in the face of death. When the news reached the mother and her son, they sat together, holding hands. The investigator who had helped reopen the case visited them personally, bringing copies of the photos and the translated notes. He spoke softly, aware that every word mattered. He explained that it seemed a few passengers, including the pilot of that lost flight, had survived the initial crash. They had stayed alive for some time, waiting for rescue that never came. The woman listened quietly, her tears flowing freely. Her son tried to stay strong, but even he couldn't stop the emotion that built inside him. "They didn't give up," she whispered. "He didn't give up." For years she had dreamed of hearing his voice again, wondering what his final moments were like. Now she finally knew he had fought to stay alive. That thought didn't bring pain. It brought peace. The pilot who had discovered the reflection flew out to the nearest base a few days later, where the rescue team was stationed after returning from the site. He met the leader of the expedition, who told him everything in detail. They sat outside under a pale evening sky, the mountains faint in the distance. The team leader handed him one of the photos they had taken of the wreckage. "You made this possible," he said quietly. "If you hadn't seen that reflection, this story would have stayed buried forever." The pilot looked at the photo for a long time. The image showed the plane's tail number clearly visible beneath the snow. It was haunting and beautiful at the same time. "I didn't do much," he said. "Just reported what I saw." But they both knew it was more than that. It was a reminder that sometimes, even the smallest actions can change the course of someone's life. Meanwhile, the investigators carefully transported the few items they found to the lab. Among them was the notebook, which they treated with great care. Experts used special equipment to make the faded writing more visible. Over the next few days, they uncovered more sentences. Some were simple notes about weather and survival, but there were also personal messages, words written for loved ones who might one day read them. One line stood out among the rest. "If anyone finds this, tell my family I kept my promise. I tried to come home." When the woman saw those words, she pressed the page to her chest and cried silently. For 2 decades, she had wondered if he had thought of her and their son before the end. Now she knew he had. That single sentence was enough to heal years of unanswered pain. The discovery made headlines in local news. The story spread not as a tragedy, but as a tale of love and perseverance. People from across the country sent letters to the family, messages of sympathy, admiration, and prayers. Strangers wrote about how the story reminded them to appreciate the people they loved, to never give up hope. Reporters also reached out to the pilot who had made the original sighting. When asked why he had decided to report something so small, he simply said, "Because it didn't feel right to ignore it. Sometimes the world gives you a small sign, and you're meant to pay attention." Those words touched many hearts. The story became a symbol of how even after decades of silence, truth can still rise to the surface if someone cares enough to look. The investigation continued for a few more weeks. The rescue team returned to the site several times, documenting everything and collecting what remained of the aircraft and the shelter. Eventually, they placed a small memorial stone at the spot, a simple plaque with the names of those who had been on the flight. The woman and her son were invited to attend a small ceremony near the base of the mountain. It wasn't grand or publicized. Only a few people were there: the rescue team, the investigator, and the pilot who had started it all. When she arrived, she carried a small bunch of white flowers. The wind was cold, but the sun was shining brightly. The pilot greeted her gently, his eyes full of quiet respect. She thanked him with trembling hands, saying, "You brought him home to me." He shook his head. "He was always there," he replied softly. "We just hadn't found him yet." They stood together as the memorial was unveiled. The woman placed the flowers at the base of the stone and whispered a prayer. Her son stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Neither spoke, but they didn't need to. The mountain seemed to speak for them, its silence full of peace. When the ceremony ended, she turned to the pilot once more. "You gave us back something we thought we lost forever," she said. "Thank you," he nodded, humbled. "It wasn't just me. It was the mountain, the light, the people who cared. I just happened to see it." Later that evening, as she looked at the fading light on the horizon, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: closure. Her husband's story had finally been told. The mystery that had haunted her life had been answered, not with despair, but with dignity. She went home that night and placed the old photo back on the table. This time, when she looked at it, she didn't cry. She smiled, because now she knew that love truly does survive even the longest silence. The world might forget stories like this, but she never would. And as the night sky filled with stars, one of them seemed to shine a little brighter, as if her husband's spirit was finally at peace, watching over the family he had never stopped loving. The news spread slowly, but reached the family like a soft echo from the past. When the pilot's report was confirmed and the investigation team returned with findings, the mother sat on the edge of her chair, clutching the same scarf she used to hold during the years of waiting. Her son, now a grown man with calm eyes and a quiet strength, sat beside her. The air in their small living room felt heavy yet strangely peaceful, as if the walls themselves understood that something long unfinished was finally coming to an end. The officials explained that the wreckage had been located deep in the northern mountain range. It was almost hidden, covered by decades of snow and rock. The weather, the remote location, and time itself had buried it well. But what they found there wasn't just metal and rust. No, they found stories. Inside the wreckage were personal things: watches, wallets, torn pages from notebooks, even small carved pieces of wood that carried words scratched by hand. Some of the notes were barely readable, but they spoke about survival, courage, and love. They told a silent story of how some passengers had survived for a while after the crash, trying to stay alive until help came. When the mother heard that, she covered her face and sobbed. She wasn't crying because of pain anymore. She cried because she finally knew the truth. For years, she had lived between two worlds, one where her husband might be alive and another where he was gone. Now she could finally breathe. Her son placed his hand on her shoulder, his heart trembling between pride and sadness. He had never known his father, but he felt him more alive in that moment than ever before. A few days later, the pilot who had made the discovery requested to meet the family. He arrived without any official uniform or formality. He looked humble and sincere, carrying only a small bag and the weight of what he had seen. When he walked in, there was silence for a few seconds. Then the mother stood up, tears in her eyes, and said softly, "You're the one who saw it." He nodded gently. "I was just doing my job," he replied, but his voice carried more emotion than his words. They invited him to sit. The mother served tea with shaky hands, the way she did when important guests came long ago. The pilot listened quietly as she shared how they had lived all those years, how she raised her son alone, how every time a plane flew overhead she would stop and look up, hoping for a sign. He said nothing for a while, but his eyes glistened as if he understood every word. He told them how on that day the light caught something below the clouds. He could have ignored it, thinking it was just a rock or ice reflecting sunlight, but something, he couldn't explain what, told him to circle back. "It didn't make sense," he said softly, "but I felt like I was supposed to look again." That small decision, that single moment of attention, had changed everything. The mother reached for his hand and said, "You didn't just find a plane. You brought back our hope." The family was later invited to visit the site where the wreckage was found. It took weeks to prepare the trip. The mountain was still dangerous and the weather unpredictable, but the mother insisted. "I've waited too long to stay home now," she said. Her son went with her, helping her climb, supporting her when the path became rough. The pilot joined them too, walking quietly behind as if guiding them home. When they reached the place, the sight made everyone silent. The remains of the aircraft lay surrounded by snow, twisted but still standing in parts. Nature had softened its edges, covering it with moss and frost as if protecting what was left. The family approached slowly. The mother touched the cold metal with trembling fingers. "This is where he was," she whispered. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she could almost hear his voice, not calling out in pain, but speaking with calmness, like he always did when he reassured her that he'd be back soon. They placed a small bouquet of mountain flowers near the site. The son took out a framed picture, the only one he had of his father, and set it on a flat rock. The pilot stood beside them, his head bowed. No one spoke for several minutes. Only the wind filled the silence, sweeping through the mountains like a soft hum. Later, as they sat around a small campfire near the base, the mother said, "I used to think hope was something that fades when the truth arrives. But now I see it differently. Hope is what kept me alive to hear this truth." The pilot smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Sometimes," he said, "the sky hides what we're not ready to see. But it never forgets." The son listened quietly, looking up at the stars. He realized that his father had not vanished in a storm. He had become a story of courage. The carvings and notes found in the wreckage told him that his father had thought of them until the very end. One line from a piece of wood stayed with him. "If they ever find this, tell them I never stopped believing." That single sentence felt like a message sent through time, a bridge between the past and the present. When they returned home, the mother placed that carved piece of wood in a glass frame beside the old family photo. Every morning she looked at it and smiled softly. It didn't hurt the way it used to. She knew now that love doesn't disappear, it just changes shape. The pilot visited them once more before leaving for another assignment. As he said goodbye, he told them that he sometimes thought about that mountain every time he flew. It reminds me that no signal, no light, no small thing should be ignored, he said. Sometimes the world sends quiet signs, and if we listen closely, we can change someone's life. The family thanked him again, and though their words were simple, they carried deep meaning. After he left, the house felt lighter. The son looked at his mother and said, "He found more than a plane, didn't he?" She nodded slowly. Yes, he found what time couldn't bury. Months later, a small memorial was built near the mountain site with names of the passengers engraved in stone. Families from different places came to visit. Flowers were laid, prayers were whispered, and for the first time in years, that silent mountain echoed with warmth and gratitude. Reporters wrote stories about the discovery, calling it a miracle of persistence. But for the family, it wasn't about headlines. It was about closure. About finally knowing that the person they loved had left behind not just memories, but proof of his strength and hope. Years passed, but the story remained alive in their hearts. The son, who had grown up without his father, often shared the story with his own children. He told them that life sometimes hides answers in unexpected places, and that even a single act of kindness, like a pilot reporting something unusual, can change the course of many lives. His children would listen wide-eyed, imagining the shining mountains and the brave people who once fought against the impossible. And every time an airplane crossed the sky, the family looked up together. The mother, now older but peaceful, would smile and whisper, "He's flying again." It was not sadness anymore. It was love carried by the wind. A love that traveled through clouds, over mountains, and across time, never fading, always alive. The story of that pilot's report became more than just a piece of news. It became a reminder that even when the world forgets, hope waits quietly for someone to notice. Sometimes it only takes one person, one moment to awaken it again. And for that family, the sound of airplanes would never be the same. It was no longer the sound of loss. It was the sound of faith finally coming home.